Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico episode 32, The King's Governor. Last time we began to talk about Juan Bautista de Anza, one of the governors who best embodied the Bourbon reforms in New Mexico. We left off after talking about his early career in the military of Sonora and his explorations to California. In 1778, Pedro Fermin de Mendinueta had already spent 11 years as governor of New Mexico. He was ordered in February 1778 to go to Chihuahua to meet his successor Juan Bautista de Anza. As for New Mexico, the picture in 1778 for the colony was grim. A drought had engulfed the frontier, which had forced the Plains tribes to increase their raiding. The campaigns had also shifted to include humans as well as goods and livestock. The concern was not only for the colony itself, but rather the richer regions of the south. From Croix's writing, quote, "If we lose the important barrier of New Mexico, which I pray God may not happen, the Indians would be masters of that immense country, and, accustomed to living by robbery, would indubitably approach us." End quote. Croix preferred Pedro de Garibay to Anza for the role of governor of New Mexico. Despite this, Anza was able to be appointed in May 1777, but it'd be a year before he actually would depart for the colony. Francisco Trebol Navarro would fill in for him as governor until he arrived. Anza would depart for New Mexico in June 1778. Between September and November, he let loose a list of reforms near El Paso before arriving in Santa Fe proper in December of that year. His efforts to make New Mexico a defensive area, called social militarization in some of the books I read, would have profound effects on the groups that lived in and interacted with New Mexico. A war council was called at Chihuahua to militarize the internal provinces. Presidial's system of 1772 had fallen short of its goals, as we've talked about, and reallocating the defenses also weakened previous settlements like Tubac. This had achieved a year or so of peace in 1776, but also meant that when violence broke out again, the Spanish Empire was unprepared to defend itself. The key to the Spanish's new strategy was trade relations with friendly groups. This was very similar to France's strategy. This overall would become known as purchase by peace. Anza promoted a show of force as the springboard to implementing this strategy of purchase by peace. Croix concurred and the plan was set into motion. Anza's part in this plan was to make war with the Comanches. At the same time, he was to make an alliance with the Hopis and the Navajos. This was to help put pressure on the Gila and Membreno Apaches. Those groups of people willing to uphold peace would receive annual gifts as a reward. Croix also insisted that those Native Americans that wanted to participate in this purchase by peace system were to go to establecimientos de paz, or peace camps, for their reward and to expose them to European culture. We talked briefly about these peace establishments in the episode on the Apaches. Spain also wanted to prepare the frontier for defense against other European powers, especially after Havana was taken by the British in the 1760s during the 7 Years' War. They worried that the English would make a play for the silver-producing regions of the empire. The Spanish adopted Prussian tactics to try and increase the army's professionalism. Did not have the cash, however, to do the same in the colonies. Instead, it tried to reform the existing structures, including things such as more training for the soldier on the ground. El Paso was the main artery that tied New Mexico to the rest of Spain, so Anza started his work there. It had received a presidio in 1683 after the Pueblo Revolt. In 1776, the presidio moved to Carrizal, and sometime after 1772, El Paso created 4 militia units to help with their defense. Citizen militias helped with defense, but those pressed into service often didn't want to serve and had trouble getting the required arms for service. Anza had almost total freedom to enact reforms as he saw fit, and at El Paso he decided regular troops were to be outfitted at cost. He combined the 4 units into 2. Free muskets, to be returned at a later date, were also provided to these new soldiers. Anza introduced a levy to help maintain the horse herds in New Mexico. He expanded trade to try and appease locals regarding the new tax, although they had to establish uniform price schedules. The Spanish also standardized militia pay to cut down on corruption, as well as for salaries to be within a 3-lock box. We talked briefly about these lock boxes as well. 3 people held the keys, and each person was needed to open the box. And at El Paso, he also ended conscription. Previously, conscription and sortero, or a lottery, had been used until roughly around 1776. This was also around the time when Anza standardized the uniform for New Mexican troops. In addition to everything else that the Spanish crown was providing, they were also to provide riding gear, although this was overall for a smaller number of troops. The Spanish also combined the horse herds of El Paso with another and assigned a rotating guard. Gunpowder was to be requested annually. Each man was to have 5 pounds of gunpowder a year. Such controls show how Spain desperately needed to cut military expenses. On the frontier, use of gunpowder had been wasteful. Now it was owned by specific officials. Those who did not use all their powder would also have to pay for the remainder. It was also to be sold at cost. Anza also let the militiamen collect bounties on saved livestock, a policy that would be repealed in 1784. They also set extra pay for those who would go above and beyond. Some of the other taxes they imposed would be repealed in 1781, but overall, Anza's reforms would bring relative peace decades after he had left the province. Overall, Anza's focus was on making sure the military units were effective and rewarding those who were willing to go above and beyond the call of duty in their service to the Spanish crown. He also established other things to make it so that soldiers would get effective pay, such as the rewards for livestock. Overall, all of these reforms to the Spanish military made it a much more effective unit and increased overall morale, which over time would pay off for the Spanish. Anza would set out to kill the Comanche chief Cuerno Verde. In December 1778, he arrived in Santa Fe. As we talked about, he had been tasked to bring combative indigenous peoples to peace, specifically the Comanches. He understood military force would need to come first. He hoped peace with the Comanches might bring others to negotiate as well. From Juan Bautista de Anza, the king's governor in New Mexico, quote, "For Governor Anza, then, the future of New Mexico truly lay in his abilities to crush the Comanches on the field of battle," end quote. Now, I know we talked about the Comanches already, but in those episodes, I avoided discussing the Spanish view of the Comanche Peace in detail as it fit better in these episodes. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. As we've talked about, the Comanches entered the Southwest in the early 1700s, after a split from the Shoshone in the late 1600s. They did well on the plains. Successful warriors were considered the best choices to lead. In the early 1700s, they began attacking New Mexican settlements regularly, and their territory stretched roughly from the Sangre de Cristos to Kansas and down to Texas. They wanted horses and tools from the Spanish or Pueblos, if not by trade, then by war. Spain's first treaty was sealed in between 1707 and 1712. However, the Comanche chiefs often breached such treaties to perpetuate the cycle of war intrinsic to their way of life. Although, as we've talked about, how binding to the entirety of the Comanches such treaties were was nebulous at best, and the Spanish often failed to actually maintain the ties needed to maintain such a peace with the Comanches. The Comanches would push the Apaches south and west while building an empire to rival New Spain by 1750. The Comanches also took up the punitive raids from the Spanish as an excuse to keep fighting and perpetuating the cycle of violence. In 1751, Governor Cachupin would grant them trade access in exchange for not raiding specific pueblos, something 300 Comanches would break by November of that year by attacking Galisteo Pueblo. Cachupin realized that the Comanche attacks had always been intended to strike fear and continued to negotiate a treaty. Get the gains, then attack again, cycle would then repeat from there. Cachupin responded with a similar strike, tracking the Comanches for 6 days. He would then attack, fighting late into the night and starting a brush fire where the Comanches had taken up their defenses. He offered surrender when they heard the cries of women and children. If they did not surrender, however, there would be no quarter. The Comanches surrendered. Of the 145 who had been attacked, 49 survived. He would release the survivors and give them a simple choice: cease hostilities and get trade concessions, or continue to feel Spanish wrath. In 1752, a Comanche party would arrive to negotiate. This allowed for some mutual accommodation among the groups. It had been contingent on Cachupin winning their respect via arms on their home turf and showing compassion to those who had surrendered. Finally, the promise of trade in exchange for peace helped. From the king's governor in New Mexico, quote, "Perhaps most important, he convinced his own people to respect the Comanches, even if they might not like them," end quote. In 1762, Cachupin would return again to find all he had created had been torn down by his successors. He would again establish peace, only to have it torn down by his successor, Pedro Mendinueta, starting in 1766. Mendinueta simply never got that the violence and warfare was simply business to the Comanches. His actions alone to tear down this peace would cause a decade of attacks and counterattacks. During this time, a chief wearing a green-horned headdress would become known for attacking Ojo Caliente, and later a legend, Cuerno Verde. He had already been magnetic before his death. His death, though, at Ojo Caliente would demand a response. True war against the Spanish. His son, Tabico Naritiante, would become the second Cuerno Verde. A severe drought also affected the decisions for war on Spain, though. The dry spell would reach its peak in the mid-1770s. This drought would drive even the Gila Apaches and Navajos to begin raiding the Spanish. Mendinueta would report that stealing livestock seemed to be the main goal of the raids during this time. Eventually, they would also begin to take hostages that could be traded for supplies. As early as 1773, they were expanding their raids as far as Cochiti and Albuquerque. Mendinueta would respond with violence. From the king's governor in New Mexico, quote, "What the governor refused to acknowledge was that his policy of unforgiving warfare had pushed the Native Americans to the edge of their cultural limits," end quote. By the mid-1770s, New Mexico is beset on all sides by hostile peoples. Cuerno Verde II, who I'm just going to continue calling Cuerno Verde as that's what most historians do, would focus on eastern settlements such as Pecos and Galisteo and those around Taos. Mendinueta would go so far as to try and compact settlers into more defensible settlements. Cachupin would respond to the pushback that they would receive from this policy by letting the Spanish build into and settle at pueblos like Taos. At Picaris, the mission would be rebuilt like a fortress. Cachupin would leave office in 1778, leaving a far more secure colony. Cuerno Verde and Anza had some similar backgrounds. Both had been born into frontier families that had achieved some prominence in the local area and were expected to answer the call to serve their nation. Both also exceeded their expectations of their peoples. Even both of their fathers had been transformed by death into heroes by their communities. The defeat of Cuerno Verde in 1779 would complete Anza's maturation as a servant of the crown, and it would bring all that he had learned, both militarily and diplomatically, to seal the Comanche Peace. Anza's ability to act like a tribal warrior chief and understand how the Plains tribes fought would be what gave him the upper hand. He would employ guerrilla warfare, traveling at night, using the landscape as cover, settlement raids, confiscation and redistribution of booty, and the taking of captives for use as hostages or slaves. Anza would also display his bravery to win Comanche respect. He would also have to completely defeat Cuerno Verde, though, to bring true peace. On August 15th, 1779, he set out with 600 militiamen, presidial troops, and Native American allies. Instead of the traditional routes through Pecos or Taos, he skirted the Rio Grande to Ojo Caliente, reaching it on the 17th. They then cut northwest through the San Juan Mountains, using the terrain as cover. On the 20th, they arrived at the banks of the Conejos. Here, 200 Utes and Apaches joined them. Soon in Comanche territory proper, they switched to evening marches. On the 30th of August, they crossed the Sierra El Margue, now known as Pikes Peak, along the Colorado's Front Range. Then, they went east to the Santa Rosa River. On August 31st, around noon, they came upon a Comanche encampment. Those in the camp had fled, being chased, and 18 would be killed and 60 wounded. 30 women and children would be captured by the Spanish. From his prisoners, Anza learned Cuerno Verde had recently set out for New Mexico, and this camp had been the rendezvous point. The governor would set out in pursuit. He would head southwest to cross the Sacramento River. After capturing some Comanche horses in early September, the Utes would abandon the campaign. On September 2nd, near Greenhorn Mountain, they would discover Cuerno Verde was coming. Anza would set an ambush along the valley and waited. At sunset, the Comanches would arrive and Anza would sound the attack. Upon noticing the Spanish, the Comanches scattered and escaped with minor casualties. Anza was advised that the Comanches were known for attacking at night, and Anza would record the following in his journal. Quote, "Judging this is difficult according to the knowledge that I have of other Indians, as well as this proposal might have something of cowardice in it. I replied that the very thing they feared I desired, that they should understand that even in case the encounter had not been decided so much in our favor, we ought, for the honor of our arms, to wait on the spot until dawn of the following day, and that, until then, it was proper that we should remain under arms. This was done." End quote. This decision would prove monumental in the conflict, as when the Comanches returned the next day on September 3rd to press the attack, the Spanish would be able to get the upper hand. Again, they would try to flank the Comanches. Seeing this, Cuerno Verde would order the retreat. However, he and his guard would be cut off. They would make a last stand, fighting to the man. To try and impose closure over this whole thing, Anza declared the site would be named Los Dolores de Santa Maria Santissima. He also had Cuerno Verde's corpse stripped of its headdress, symbolically scalping him. This headdress would be sent to Croix. Anza intended to erase the legend of Cuerno Verde entirely from both him and his heirs. By September 10th, the governor was back in Santa Fe. He demanded that the Comanches as a whole select a representative to come to the table. Anza suggested keeping the pressure on the Comanches with another campaign, but a recent war with England put the kibosh on that. But the raids had decreased, and he would manage to forge a lasting peace treaty with the Comanches, which, if taken from the Spanish view, allowed them to create in the Comanches an economic dependence for Spanish goods that allowed the Spanish to keep the Comanches in line. But as we talked about, a strong argument can be made that this economic dependence never truly manifested, and that the Comanches were simply content to continue trading with the Spanish rather than raiding for the time being. Despite this war with England, Anza was not idle. He was ordered to begin on the next phase of the Chihuahua War Council plan, peace with the Hopis. The goal was to use the Hopis to help subdue the Gila Apaches, who would help tie New Mexico to Sonora. Since the Pueblo Revolt, the Hopis had maintained some of their independence. In 1700, they had tried to reconcile with Spain, but due to the Spanish demanding complete submission to Spanish rule, rather than the compromise offered by the Hopi, Awatovi would be destroyed. Some Hopi had wanted a complete break with Spain and threatened violence against their people. At Awatovi, the people would invite Fray Juan de Guerracochea to their pueblo. There had even been talk of reestablishing the mission at Awatovi. While the friars sent news of this promising development back to Santa Fe, the other Hopis were preparing for revenge. When the time came, they fell upon the pueblo of Awatovi, trapping the men in the kivas by pulling the ladders up behind them as they entered for a ritual. They would then toss flaming bundles of sticks into the kivas, leaving the men to burn. Many other residents would be tortured and massacred. The remaining prisoners would also soon be murdered as their captors could not decide on how to divvy them up, killing them at a site now known as Skeleton Mound. Those that did remain were finally distributed to the other Hopi pueblos. And until 1775, the Hopi would stand as a counter to Christianity, making war against those that did adopt the Spanish religion. In 1775, the friar at Zuni, Silvestre Vilés de Escalante, would be invited to the Hopi pueblos. Escalante would determine during his visits that force of arms was the only way to return the Hopi to the Christian fold. Otherwise, they were only interested in relations with the Spanish in hard times or when they stood to gain. In 1779, when Anza approached them, times were hard for the Hopi. Anza ordered the friar at Zuni, Andres Garcia, to communicate that if they were ready to become Christian, Anza would supply them and relocate them to the Rio Grande. He also offered many economic concessions. Anza thought missions among the Hopi would be too expensive to maintain, but he also probably wanted to integrate them in the same way he'd advocated for in Sonora. He also believed that an alliance with the Hopis would allow the Spanish to get the military aid they desired. Otherwise, he feared the Hopis would turn and instead ally themselves with hostile groups. Anza had suggested a presidio in Hopi territory. By November 1799, he had heard reports that a group of Hopis were living among the Navajo. This was false, but the drought had gotten bad for everyone. The Hopis of Walpi would express a desire to accept Anza's deal to move to the Rio Grande. Quir reminded Anza that the Hopi were not to be relocated by force. Anza would request provisions be sent to Zuni to be given to the Hopis. He also ordered to offer aid in a way that did not hurt their pride, or in such a way that it would feel contingent on subjugation to Spain. In February 1780, Anza ordered Garcia to go with the Western Hopi pueblos and recruit those who had wanted to relocate. 77 would return with him. Supposedly, others were also interested, but the Navajo had interfered. Anza had been told there were 40 families that wished to relocate and would travel to Hopi territory to get them. Once there, he'd be informed that these families had been killed by the Navajos. He would demand to meet with the principal Hopi chief at Orabi. Here, Anza would discuss what he could do to end their plight. He would emphasize that the Spanish wanted the Hopis to return to the fold, but it had to be voluntary. The chief agreed to let those who had wished to convert to leave, but he and his men would remain to die a warrior's death. Anza agreed to try and help against the Navajo and Utes, and to try and improve economic ties between the Hopis and the Spanish. 30 more families would follow Anza back to New Mexico, bringing the total number of Hopis in the colony to 200. However, compared to the 7,494 Escalante estimated of the Hopis in 1775, the 798 that Anza estimated would return, it was not a huge amount. Anza then turned his focus to the Athabascan tribes. He turned to first an all-out campaign against the Gila Apaches, who had been attacking Sonoran settlements for some time. It would also help bring a semblance of peace among the routes Anza charted to Alta California, a key to the Spanish plan to consolidate the northwestern frontier. This would also help the Spanish establish the settlements at Yuma that had been promised so many years ago. All of this was to make Alta California a successful colony and to contain the Russians. To fight the Gila Apaches, though, Anza needed the Navajo. Without military might, getting the Navajo on his side, though, was a tall order. Since Cuerno Verde had been defeated, the Navajos had begun raiding in the Comanche's stead. While Anza failed to secure an alliance with the Navajo, the Spanish would launch their offensive against the Gilas in May 1784, with 5 divisions from Sonora and Nueva Vizcaya. The offensive against the Gila and Chiricahua Apaches would stall in July of that year. The Gilas would ally with the Navajos to attack the Sonoran and Nueva Vizcayan frontier. Anza tried to pressure the Navajos by denying trade if they remained friendly with the Gila Apaches, and even hinted at the use of arms. To make this threat more believable, Anza would be ordered to establish an armed command at Laguna. This would have an effect, and by the end of 1785, several Navajo bands would break ties with the Gilas. Others would refuse to bend the knee to the Spanish. In 1786, the Spanish planned to renew the attacks on the Gila and try to unite the Navajos under one leader. Anza would attempt to meet with several chiefs to appoint 2 speakers for all the Navajos, get military aid against the Gilas from them, and other agreements, such as becoming sedentary allies of Spain. He would also, at Commandant General Jacobo Ugarte Loyola's suggestion, offer the title of general and lieutenant to these 2 chiefs that acted as speakers. He also tried to promote intermarriage between the Pueblos and the Navajos. Finally, Anza was to begin an offensive against the Gila Apaches, with Navajo help to push the Gilas south. Breaking this alliance between the Apaches and the Navajo would help reduce the number of raids in New Mexico and shift their focus south. By 1787, the Mimbreno Apaches would become a target as well. The Spanish would fail to make a lasting peace with the Apaches and Navajo. The Navajo would break the peace that he had forged in 1796, again siding with the Gila Apaches. This break of peace in 1796 would be the beginning of the cycle once again, and relations would begin to deteriorate between the Spanish and New Mexico's neighbors. The Comanche Peace that Anza forged, though, would last for the remainder of the colonial period. Anza's efforts promised to help secure New Mexico, and as a result bring more trade from the rest of the empire. That just meant that the strife with the enemies became strife at home. There were many at the home front that did not like the reforms he had passed at El Paso, and were concerned that they would be brought to their own parts of the province. New Mexicans thought they could resist these reforms, but Anza's work had endeared him to government officials. His superiors were determined to turn New Mexico into a buffer zone, with or without the People's Agreement. In 1772, Mendinueta had made good arguments to centralize New Mexican towns. He had also made a distinction between pueblos and Spanish settlements. He also noted that the settlements should be walled. Anza had been given orders to investigate these suggestions. Bernardo Maria y Pacheco, the cartographer of the Escalante expedition, would be tapped to make a map of New Mexico for Anza. Settlement patterns were based on enough water for subsistence farming, and the Spanish preferred a central plaza that had streets fed into it, as it was defensible. New Mexican towns, however, did not often follow this layout that the Spanish preferred elsewhere. Instead of trying to overcome New Mexican resistance to resettlement, he decided to make New Mexicans take a little bit more of a role in their defense. He demanded towns be converted into defensible settlements. People didn't like the building codes, though. They brought their grievances to Croix, and they accused Anza and his officials of corruption. In the case of the officials, that was what had kept New Mexico's government turning. They also blamed Anza for a food crisis, actually caused by a drought. They may have also been trying to downplay his achievements, as he was not a native son of the province. Spain was also concerned with both American and British designs on their territory. Spain would still help with the American Revolution, though, even declaring on England in 1779. New Mexico probably had little to fear, although there was at least one scare where the British might have been planning to make alliances with groups to New Mexico's east. As a result, New Mexico's borders would essentially be sealed to outsiders. Levied taxes for the war effort also burdened the populace. Anza tried to spare the population of some of these problems. Zunis, Hopis, and Pecos would be excluded from these levies, though. In total, New Mexico would raise 3,677 pesos for the war effort that helped free the country that would one day annex them. Peace would be declared between Spain and England in 1783. Anza would suggest a fort out west to aid the Hopis and help with defense of the province. Instead, he would be ordered to rebuild Santa Fe's Presidio. By January 1781, he had detailed plans, but was unable to get the funds. The project would not be completed until October 1791, after he had left office. Anza also tried to connect New Mexico to surrounding provinces. A route to Sonora had been a dream for a few decades at this point, and the environment was finally right. The Spanish planned to start the trail just north of the Jornada del Muerto at a location known as San Cristobal. From there, they would cross the Mimbres Mountains, Gila Wilderness to Las Nutrias, and then to Arrecife. The Crown would pull funding from the project, though, and it would not materialize again until 1780. 150 men were to accompany the yearly cordon from Albuquerque to San Cristobal. Fall was chosen as the time to go as it lowered the risk of Apache raids. They would skirt the Mimbres Mountains, but would arrive in Arrecife. But it was not a viable route. It would not be until 1795 that Zuniga would be successful in creating a route between Sonora and New Mexico. Earlier governors had become governor with the expectation of profiting from the position. The Bourbons saw this differently. Governors should be a central authority that were agents of the royal will. Anza would be tasked with increasing the power of the state New Mexico. He did well in doing so for the military and the clergy. The judicial system, however, would prove to be difficult in reforming. All of these reforms were meant to make the wheels of government more efficient. Anza would introduce communication reform, both with the home front and the surrounding provinces. Hispanos, however, liked their isolation and relative autonomy. Anza would also cite this preference from the locals as his biggest obstacle to the governmental and judicial reforms he attempted to implement. The Bourbon philosophy on rule could best be summarized from the start as Hobbes' despotism. Truly, though, this was reactionary. They ruled an empire beset by enemies without and questions of the ruler's legitimate claims to rule from within. They introduced a ministerial system to help take power from the nobles. It was also about skill and loyalty, not social class. The efforts in New Mexico also weren't just about centralizing power, but for setting up defense of this empire they ruled. France would cede their New World territory to Spain in 1762, leaving them to face Britain and Russia alone. It was also a warning to the Bourbons that Spanish power was waning in North America. The cycles of violence between Spanish settlers and Native American groups was the biggest worry, though, at the time. The administrative controls of the internal provinces was a mirror of the general structures the Bourbons introduced elsewhere. Streamlined bureaucracy was always difficult due to the remoteness of the region, though. Local politics also would cause issues. Even the office of governor was to be reformed. The king could remove Anza at his discretion. He also removed the title of Captain General from the governorship upon appointment of Anza, making Mendinueta the last governor of New Mexico to hold the title. Instead, Anza would be Comandante de Armas. New Mexican governors had always had trouble surviving on their salaries, and historically New Mexico had been exempt from many taxes. Among other things, the governor controlled land grants, water rights, and regulated travel. He would conduct an inspection of the province. He could order the Spanish colonists to arm themselves. He would even order his officials to inspect the colonials' arms. The biggest thing Anza did to the judicial system was to transfer from the Audiencia de Guadalajara to the General Command. Ordinary legal cases remained under the Audiencia, though. The northern frontier had more flexible laws and justice, as few officials were trained in law. The goal of laws in the Spanish Empire was the well-being of the community, not winners and losers, as it is in the American tradition. The 327-mile separation between the colony's two major cities, Santa Fe and El Paso, made communication difficult. It took years for some proclamations to get disseminated. The existing mail system would be expanded along the frontier, but this did not include Santa Fe. The Spanish created a new system for mail to get between Santa Fe and Arzepe. They also created a small squad to carry the mail to El Paso. Deliveries were to be scattered, so that no one could figure out the timetables and thus intercept the caravan. None of the system was to be communicated to others. Anza was ready to go anywhere else, requesting leave in 1781. Manuel de Flan would be appointed in 1784, but he would instead take up a post as intendant of Puebla in Nueva Vizcaya. Anza tried again to leave in 1786. From the king's governor, quote, Anza's successes and shortcomings as governor cannot be measured in absolute terms, but they do have to be considered from the perspective of the Bourbon reforms. It was to New Mexico, after all, that the king had sent Anza to achieve what his predecessors had failed to bring about, a lasting peace between Indians and Spaniards. Anza accomplished this military task. End quote. But we are not done with Anza just yet. We have one last thing to talk about, his relationship with the friars. To put it simply, the Franciscans did not like Anza. The friars had from the start been guests in the pueblos, to be expelled when the pueblos so desired, and the friars never really came to own pueblo land for their missions. The pueblos instead controlled the colony's food production into the 1780s, and the Spanish provided goods and services in exchange for the food and the pueblos tolerating their friars. But the friars' mission of conversion would fail. Despite his close ties with the Jesuits, Anza was critical of the missions, as we've talked about in the last episode. He argued that the missions did not incentivize the indigenous population to become active citizens. The peninsular and American-born friars often squabbled, something Anza could take advantage of to drive a wedge between them. The friars failed to master Pueblo languages, and the peninsulars claimed that Anza discriminated against them. A court case involving a friar would begin to deteriorate relations even further. Anza used this case and another to inflame tensions against the peninsulars, and Indian service for the friars was abolished in 1784. The control of the crown over Catholic clergy allowed them to turn religion into a cultural trait that bound people to the Spanish Empire. Overall, the king demanded obedience of the clergy in exchange for their position. The clergy would push back hard against things such as the abolishment of Indian servitude. Anza argued that they should consolidate the missions to cut expenses. The 1780-1781 smallpox epidemic killed some 5,000 people, a quarter of the population of the missions, and the Madrid bread riots were the impetus to begin weakening the hold the clergy had on power. This was one of the reasons the Jesuits had been expelled, after all, as we talked about. The Comanche Peace, though, would be the crowning achievement of Anza's career, and he would leave office in 1787. Anza's health would deteriorate during 1788, and he would die December 20th, 1788, from the king's governor in New Mexico. Quote, as the citizens of Arzepe gathered to bid him farewell, they must have marveled at the extraordinary life Anza had lived in New Spain's northern frontier, whether as a military officer, statesman, or friend. He had served them well as a native son of Sonora, but it was in the remote colony of New Mexico where Anza made his most significant contributions to the Spanish Empire, and where he had been, in every sense, the king's governor. End quote. When looked at through the lens of the Bourbon reforms, Governor Juan Bautista de Anza was the man who best embodied them. He was loyal to the crown, ambitious, talented, and well chosen for the positions given to him. He had made New Mexico safer by reforming the military, forging ties with friendly indigenous nations, and bringing those who were not friendly to the table to negotiate. He forged ties between New Mexico and other Spanish colonies, expanding the small economy of the province. He reformed and streamlined the entire government, cutting down on abuse and corruption and saving money for the crown. His successes were not without failures, though. Despite his best efforts, he had failed to bring the Navajos and Apaches into the fold. He or the friars had failed to increase the conversion and assimilation of the Pueblos, and New Mexicans were still resisting many of the reforms imposed upon them by the crown. But it is here that we will move on. I've got about 3 or so more episodes between this one and the bringing the Spanish colonial period to an end, where we will summarize one last time before we launch into the Mexican period. If you have questions for the Q&A, you should submit them to our show via our website, engineeringfire.org, or the show's email, michael@engineeringfire.org. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.